Located 230 kilometres north of Kalgoorlie, or a 9 hours drive from Perth, you'll find the small town of Leonora. It's possible this had the smallest public tramway in Australia, and no doubt in WA. It was definitely the most isolated. It ran a single service just 4 kilometres long to its sister town of Gwalia. But why? Well, mostly because of gold. But its story is otherwise an interesting one, spanning the power sources of steam, electricity and petrol within a 20-year period. The area was first formally explored by Europeans with a team led by John Forrest in 1869. They were in search of the missing Leichhardt expedition from 20 years earlier. They camped near a large hill, which Forrest named Mount Leonora. The two townships are now located on each side. However, Forrest would never find Leichhardt. Even to this day, his final resting place is unknown and remains one of Australia's biggest mysteries. It wouldn't be until the 1890s that prospectors began exploring the area. Gold was eventually discovered in 1895 by Edward Sullivan, just north of modern-day Leonora. The first lease was pegged a year later, and the town site was established soon after. Leonora was a hotbed of discoveries during the gold rush. This led to the establishment of the Sons of Gwalia Mine, which is still in operation today. The town grew considerably, with a train connection to Kalgoorlie operating from 1903 and the thirsty miners owning 7 hotels by 1908. The tram story starts in 1901, however. The Sons of Gwalia Mine was about 5 kilometres south of Leonora and employed most of its residents. While there was a shack community forming around the mine site, most of the businesses and permanent housing was in Leonora. As such, a solution was needed for reliable transport between the two settlements. While there was a coach service, the leaders of the Leonora community looked towards light rail, a subject which was taken more seriously by politicians in Perth. But I digress. This would encourage the miners to live more permanently in Leonora, but most importantly, be great for the local businesses. This way, Leonora could be separated as a traditional town for living and entertaining, while Gwalia could just be for work. An early industrial area, if you will. Some sources, including a sign in the Gwalia Museum, states the tramway was privately owned from 1901 and then bought out by the council in 1903. But by reading through many newspapers from the time, I found this wasn't quite the case. There were discussions about a steam tramway as early as March 1901, followed by a town meeting in early April discussing if it should be private or not. It was ultimately decided to be run by the municipality, however, and the idea and route were approved by the council by late July. But of course, there did appear to be resistance to the idea. A quote, lively town meeting happened between the mayor and local ratepayers in February 1902. Apparently, there was such a war of words that people stood up and left. No word as to what these words were exactly, but no doubt it was about money, considering the amount of whinging and the countless letters to the editor I read. But obviously, the mayor got his way, and the quote, liveliest meeting ever held in the town, then terminated. There were lots of back and forth and red tape to grind through over the following months. This was mostly to do with municipality boundaries beyond Leonora. But finally, in the September of 1902, the Attorney General advised the council to proceed under the Tramways Act at once. But roadblocks continued. By February 1903, Mr. Snell, who was the mayor who had been spearheading this idea, had by this point taken 2 trips to Perth at personal expense to secure a £4,000 loan from the government. This didn't eventuate, followed by another failed attempt at the National Bank. Instead, he managed to get a loan at 7% from a quote, Fremantle man. That's a bit ominous. Regardless as to where the money came from, construction could finally commence several years after the idea was initially floated. It was built in the following months by local labour, but a company called Messrs. Baird, Johnson & Co. were the supplier of the building materials and cars. The 3-foot 6-inch gauge tracks were imported from England. The tramway was about 4 kilometres long, with turnabouts at each end. It ran from the intersection of Forest Street and Tower Street in Leonora, down Tower Street, and turned around at the intersection of Kane Street in Gwalia. The car barn, and later the powerhouse, were located near the intersection of Tower and Rochester Streets. The car barn survived until 1953, when it was blown over by a storm. The Shire Works Depot is supposedly now on the site. The steam tramways was such a big deal that the opening day, the 10th of October 1903, was declared a local public holiday. It was a huge event to mark the occasion. A local band led a parade down the main street for the tram's initial run. A blue ribbon was placed over the tracks, and once the tram broke it, the mayor smashed a bottle of champagne over a wheel. There was then a banquet, various speakers, and the tram carted a delegation to Gwalia for a picnic. After the picnic, the tram was formally handed over to the municipality. The steam tram itself was actually an ex-WAGR locomotive built in 1884. It had been used in Bunbury for shunting purposes and recently had a new boiler installed. It was called the Leonora, but was referred to by the locals as Puffing Billy. It pulled 2 double-decker tramcar trailers. These were manufactured in Perth by a company called A.T. Wardle. They could carry 50 passengers, but had the disadvantage of having no brakes. A return trip cost 3 dimes, with a service running every 30 minutes. It was a popular service that was used as intended, but it wasn't without its accidents. The first I found was in the May of 1905. A night watchman called Thomas Hines was fatally run over. He had been drinking heavily and passed out on the track, very close to the Grand Hotel. There was another fatality in the March of 1906, this time a woodcutter named William Simonson. He too had been drinking, but this time at the Gwalia Hotel. This was made worse by the driver suffering from fatigue, having worked 88 hours over that week. I was surprised by how gruesome the newspaper descriptions were. I'll spare you the gory details, but they didn't hold back on the details in those days. By 1906, the steam tram had carried over 61,000 passengers, but was considered expensive to run. The tram over its life always ran at a loss, but was too important to cancel for business reasons. It greatly helped the economy between the two towns. As such, the system received an upgrade in 1908. Leonora was known for its progressiveness at the time. As such, they installed a power station for a new electric tram. Additionally, this was also used for street lighting and private customers in their homes. There were at least 70 customers by November 1908. The municipality used the same Melbourne company that built the tramways and lighting for Fremantle. The power station and associated infrastructure cost over £8,000 to build, a major investment for the time. The steam locomotive was sold to Bunnings Bros and used in milling operations in the southwest. That was replaced with tram number 1, which was imported from Philadelphia. The old trailers were still used, but the upper decks were removed. Tram number 1 used the double overhead wire system. This was common on trolley buses, but unusual for trams. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe this was because the same power lines were used to power the town. Again, the inaugural tram ride was a big event in the town, although I don't think anyone got an extra day off this time around. Mrs. Avard, wife of the mayor, broke a wine bottle over the tram. Council members and their friends then travelled to the terminus with the town band playing on board. For those not lucky enough to be on the tram, the fire brigade showered the spectators with water as they watched it rumble down the street. The tram ran well, but used a large chunk of the available electricity. During heavy usage on Saturday nights, the street lights usually had to be switched off to enable its operation. This also dimmed the lights in the residents' homes. They knew when it was turning around in Gwalia, as that's when the lights dimmed the most. That then became a problem. When the tram was at its busiest and carrying a full load, 6 horses were used to pull it around. As such, the tram was shortened by 2.4 metres in 1912, converting it to a saloon-type body. Accidents still happened, however. That same year, the tram claimed another victim. This time, a man named Richard Priest had been drinking and was passed out on the track in Gwalia. Although on this occasion, he had alighted from the very same tram that would kill him on its return trip 40 minutes later. There was a very sudden stop to the tram service in 1915 when the power station was destroyed by a fire. The cause was never discovered, and the complex was only insured for £1,200. That wasn't enough to cover a replacement and put the council in a very bad financial position. Arrangements were hastily made with the Sons of Gwalia Mine to supply power for the town, but presumably at a limited capacity. As such, there was only a sporadic tram service with high fares that was quickly cancelled altogether. The only alternative were taxis, which ran on no fixed timetable, and usually only when the vehicles were full. They weren't cheap either, and as such, wasn't considered a great solution. It was worried that most of the workers would move back to Gwalia. The power station was ultimately rebuilt, but the surprise rebuild cost meant that the electric tram service couldn't be reactivated. It's at this point when members of the public, mostly Leonora business owners, stepped up to create a tram replacement. With the power grid out of the question, the idea of a petrol-powered tram was introduced. Community involvement released the council from liability, but also gave them a chance to financially recover so the town could have electricity. And it's not like the council didn't try. There were reports of them trying to secure a loan from the government in the July of 1916. However, by the November there was a change in government and the loan was rejected. Instead, contributions from the community led to the acquisition of a petrol vehicle. At first it would run on the road, before being converted to run on the rails with flanged wheels. This was an overland 30cwt truck and was nicknamed the Tank. This was a great solution, despite being more flammable. It caught fire in 1920 thanks to petrol leaking onto the exhaust. Luckily it was empty at the time apart from the driver, who jumped out after failing to extinguish the fire. It rolled down the hill towards Leonora, where the fire brigade intervened. Thankfully it was insured and was put back into service soon after. This ran until early 1921. A fire destroyed half of the Sons of Gwalia Mine in 1921, and nearly the entire workforce, about 400 men, were laid off. As such, the joint populations of Gwalia and Leonora dropped to just over 1,000. The mine would reopen in 1923, but the tram did not return. Like many trams around Australia, it was replaced with a bus service. The rest of the tram network and equipment was sold off. This included to a representative of the Fremantle Municipal Tramways and Electric Lighting Board. I'll make a video about them one day, I swear. However, tram number 1 lay abandoned next to the powerhouse for years. Eventually, a resident named Dick Leaney saved it from being scrapped in 1942, converting it to a sleep out in his backyard. He had originally painted the tram back in 1907. He eventually donated it to the Tourist Committee in either 1982 or 1996, depending on who you ask, which then lived in a Shire depot before receiving some sort of restoration in 2007. It appeared to have deteriorated quite a bit by 2014, however, when it was further restored by Stephen Peacock. This required quite a bit of effort over a 3-month period, but is now located in the Gwalia Museum next to Hoover House. It's only been restored for presentation reasons, but Stephen did a great job. If you visit the museum, you can walk right in and explore the inside of the tram. Speaking of Gwalia, stay tuned for a future video about the town. It has an interesting story in its own right. I visited both Leonora and Gwalia on a filming trip last year as we were based in Kalgoorlie. I turned that into a behind the scenes video. There's also a separate video where we travelled to Kew, then Geraldton and up to Cowbarry. In the most recent, I visited Meckering on a very short filming trip using my new whiz-bang Subaru Forester car camping setup. I vlogged the trip, but we also camped in a ghost town. This, along with a vlog that involves the construction process and camping amongst other abandoned history, can be viewed for a membership subscription. I've also released behind the scenes vlog on how I made the Claysbrook video, several vlogs where I take you along on reconnaissance missions, and a travel guide to Melbourne. In that, I take you to several Victorian locations that you might find interesting. The support program is just $3 a month and can be cancelled at any time. That $3 includes the extra content, shows your username at the end of the videos, and highlights any comments you might make. All money earned goes back into the production of future videos. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.